The fundamentals.
Ever feel like you're stuck in this philosophical maze when you've got like a really tough decision to make?
Right, yeah.
Whether it's like a personal thing you're going back and forth on, or maybe a big political issue that's got you thinking.
Yeah, totally.
There's this framework that's been around for ages. It's called utilitarian ethics. And it might be a good compass for those situations.
Yeah, it's a good way to think about it.
It can help you kind of navigate those tricky decisions.
For sure.
The basic idea of utilitarianism is pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
You want to go with the choice that brings the most good to the most people.
Right.
But when you really start to think about it, there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, it gets pretty complex.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Awesome.
We're going to take a close look at all the fundamental philosophical principles behind utilitarianism and how it approaches decision-making, especially when it comes to, like, moral and even legal decisions.
Right.
We've got a whole bunch of sources here that really dig into the core ideas.
Oh, perfect.
And how they actually play out in the real world.
Cool.
So we're not just going to be like, okay, what is utilitarianism?
Yeah.
We're going to try to understand why it works the way it does.
Yeah.
And some of those tricky parts when you actually try to put it into practice, hopefully by the end of this, it'll all kind of click for you in a new way.
Sounds good.
All right, so to kick things off, let's talk about this foundational idea of consequentialism.
Okay, so what's really interesting about utilitarianism right off the bat is that it's a type of consequentialism.
Okay.
And basically, consequentialism judges an action as right or wrong, based totally on its consequences.
Okay.
So the outcome is like everything.
So it's not about whether the action itself feels right or wrong in the moment.
Yeah.
It's about what actually happens because of it.
Exactly.
So let's say you're trying to figure out the best way to fund like a community project or something.
Okay, yeah.
A consequentialist approach would look at which funding method is going to actually benefit the community the most.
Right.
Regardless of the method that's used to get there.
Exactly.
It's the impact that really counts.
It's the end result.
How does this way of thinking compare to other ethical viewpoints, though?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really sets it apart from some of the other big ethical theories.
Okay.
Like if you take deontology, it's all about duty and rules.
Okay.
A deontologist would say there are certain actions that are just inherently right or wrong.
Okay.
No matter the consequences.
Okay.
Like think for the idea of lying.
Right.
A deontologist might say, you know, lying is always wrong, even if it could prevent something worse from happening.
Interesting.
And then you've got virtue ethics.
Okay.
Which focuses more on the character of the person who's doing the action.
Right.
More than like the specific action itself or the outcome.
So it's really about who they are as a person.
Exactly.
Okay, so utilitarianism is really all about those consequences.
Exactly.
So what's the main guiding principle that tells us what makes for a good consequence?
So that's where the greatest happiness principle comes in.
Okay.
Sometimes it's called the principle of utility.
Okay.
This is like the core of utilitarianism.
Okay.
And it's really tied to thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, I've heard those names.
So it basically says an action is right if it leads to more happiness or pleasure.
Okay.
And wrong if it causes more unhappiness or pain.
All right.
And the really important part here is maximizing that overall well-being.
So it's not just about one person's happiness.
Yeah.
It's about the total happiness.
Right.
Minus the suffering.
Exactly.
For everyone involved.
Yes.
And when we talk about happiness here, it's not just about like simple pleasures, right?
No.
Especially when you think about someone like Mill.
Yeah, especially with Mill.
He made some important distinctions there.
Yeah, he brought in this qualitative aspect to happiness.
Okay.
So he talked about higher and lower pleasures.
Okay.
Lower pleasures are kind of basic, like eating or just being comfortable physically. Yeah. But higher pleasures are more about intellectual pursuits.
Oh.
Feeling good about yourself morally.
Okay.
Appreciating beauty.
So it's about like deeper satisfaction.
Exactly. And Mill would say those higher pleasures are just more valuable
Interesting.
than the lower ones.
Okay.
Even if you could have a lot more of the lower pleasure.
So it's not just like a quantity thing.
No.
It's also about the quality of the happiness.
Exactly.
Okay, so that adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah.
Now, another key aspect of utilitarianism is impartiality.
Right.
So how does it ensure that we're considering everyone fairly when we make these decisions?
Yeah, that brings up this fundamental fairness thing.
Yeah.
So utilitarianism says that you have to give equal weight to everyone's happiness and suffering.
Okay.
It doesn't matter who they are.
Okay.
Like, no one person's well-being is automatically more important than anyone else's.
So it's about treating everyone equally in that sense.
Right. And when you're making a moral judgment or you're thinking about a law, everyone who's going to be affected by that decision, their interests have to be considered equally.
That seems like a really high standard.
It is.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, so imagine you're in charge of distributing this limited supply of a life-saving vaccine during a pandemic.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
A utilitarian approach would say you got to distribute it to save the most lives and to reduce suffering as much as possible.
Okay.
And you have to give everyone equal consideration.
No matter who they are.
No matter their age, their social status.
Nothing.
Anything.
It's at the overall impact.
It's about the impact.
Not about playing favorites.
Exactly.
And I remember one of the sources even talks about this idea of a moral preference.
Yeah.
And how it emphasizes equal importance to everyone's interests.
Yes, that's a key point.
Okay, so it's about the good of the collective.
Right.
Which leads us to this idea of aggregate welfare. How does that work in practice?
So the big thing to understand is that utilitarianism cares about the total well-being of everyone affected by a decision.
Okay.
You're looking at the big picture.
Okay.
And the goal is to maximize that collective good.
Okay.
But sometimes that means making tough choices.
Where individuals might have to sacrifice something.
Yeah, potentially.
And this is where some of the ethical challenges around utilitarianism pop up, right?
Yeah.
Because what makes the most people happy isn't always fair to everyone.
Absolutely.
And our sources really dig into this.
Yeah, they do.
Like this whole idea that focusing on aggregate welfare could lead to situations where a larger group benefits at the expense of a smaller group.
Exactly.
And that raises all these questions about justice.
It does.
And individual rights.
Yes.
Like, is it ever okay to take away some people's rights if it makes a lot of other people happy?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Can the majority's happiness justify the suffering of a minority?
Right.
Those are some really tough questions.
They are.
And it feels like we're getting into some of those classic ethical dilemmas.
Right.
Like the trolley problem.
Exactly.
That always comes up.
And one of our sources even talks about the torture dilemma.
Okay.
Which is this hypothetical situation where torturing one person could get information to save many lives.
Oh, wow.
And from a very strict utilitarian perspective, in some cases, they might say that the torture is justified. Because you're weighing the potential increase in well-being for all those people against the harm to that one person being tortured.
So it really highlights that clash between utilitarianism and our feelings about individual rights.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about how these principles are actually put into practice.
Okay.
Specifically, this difference between act and rule utilitarianism.
Okay.
What's the main difference there?
That's a really important distinction. So act-utilitarianism says that for every single action, we should look at the consequences directly.
In that moment.
In that specific situation.
Okay.
And the right action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number in that particular case.
So it's a case-by-case thing.
Yeah, it's very specific.
Okay.
Rule utilitarianism is different.
Okay.
It takes more of a step back.
Okay.
It's looking at the bigger picture.
Okay.
It says we should create general rules that if we follow them consistently, they'll lead to the best outcomes in the long run.
Okay.
So instead of evaluating each action in isolation, you're evaluating the utility of the rules themselves.
That sounds like it could be a lot more stable and predictable.
It does.
Than always trying to figure out the consequences of every single tiny thing.
Right.
But are there any drawbacks to that approach?
So one of our sources points out something really interesting.
Okay.
They say that if you fully develop rule utilitarianism, it could actually end up looking a lot like act-utilitarianism.
Really?
Yeah.
How so?
Because if you try to create rules for every single possible exception and every unforeseen circumstance.
To make sure you get the best outcome no matter what.
Yeah, to always get the best outcome.
Yeah.
Those rules could become so specific that they basically just tell you to do the action that maximizes utility in each specific context, which is act-utilitarianism.
So it's like you're trying to write a rule book for life.
Yeah.
But it ends up being so detailed that it just tells you to do what's best in every situation.
Right. Exactly.
That's fascinating.
It is.
Do you have another analogy maybe to illustrate that?
Yeah, so think of act-utilitarianism as like deciding your route home from work.
Okay.
Every day based on the traffic.
Okay.
You're checking those traffic updates and adjusting your route.
Okay.
Rule utilitarianism is more like the general traffic laws.
Okay.
Like stopping at red lights. Yeah. And driving on the right side of the road.
Yeah.
Because we generally believe that those rules are going to keep traffic flowing smoothly.
And keep everyone safe.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've gone through all these core principles.
Yeah.
Now, how does utilitarianism work as a framework for actually making decisions?
Right.
Both personally and like on a larger scale with law and policy.
So utilitarianism provides this kind of structured approach.
Okay.
Like almost a way to calculate
Okay.
if you approve or disapprove of certain actions.
Right.
By focusing on those predicted consequences and the goal of maximizing well-being.
Okay.
It aims to give you a basis for moral decision-making.
Okay.
That goes beyond just your personal feelings or your biases.
Yeah.
And one of our sources even talks about how it tries to provide a foundation for legal judgments that's more objective.
So it's about trying to be more rational.
Yeah.
And focused on the outcome when we make ethical and legal decisions.
Exactly.
And this is really important when you think about public policy.
Yes.
And legislation.
Absolutely.
Because governments have to make decisions all the time.
Right.
That involve balancing different needs and allocating resources.
And utilitarianism provides this framework for choosing policies that will benefit society as a whole.
Okay.
The goal is to maximize happiness.
Okay.
And minimize suffering for everyone.
But as we talked about earlier, actually measuring happiness across a whole population is really hard.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge.
Especially when everyone has different values.
Right.
And experiences.
Absolutely.
And our sources talk about this a lot.
They do.
Like, how do you actually put a number on different types of pleasure?
Yeah.
Or happiness? How do you compare, like, intellectual satisfaction to the physical pleasure of, like, a good meal or a good workout?
Exactly.
How do you balance short-term gratification with long-term well-being?
Yeah.
Those are some tough questions.
Very tough questions.
That utilitarianism has to deal with.
Yeah, it's an ongoing challenge.
And this difficulty in measuring happiness also ties back into the tension with rights and justice.
Yes.
Because if you can't accurately measure happiness, how do you know if maximizing the overall amount is really worth potentially sacrificing individual rights or the rights of a minority group?
That's the question.
Yeah, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
And is it ever justified to violate those rights?
Yeah, that's a big ethical debate.
Yeah.
And, you know, those thought experiments like the trolley problem, they really highlight this conflict between utilitarianism and our beliefs about basic rights and justice.
And our sources even mention how our moral judgments are influenced by both our emotions, like gut feelings, and our more rational calculations.
Right.
So our emotions might make us lean towards a sense of duty or rights.
Yeah.
While our more rational side might be more utilitarian.
Right. Thinking about those costs and benefits.
So when we're trying to make a utilitarian decision, it's not just about finding the action with the best outcome.
Right.
It's also about considering all the other possible actions we could take.
Absolutely.
So at its core, utilitarian decision-making involves looking at all the alternatives in a given situation and choosing the one that's most likely to produce the best overall results.
The greatest probable benefit.
Taking everything into account.
Exactly.
So it's not a simple process.
No.
Okay, so this has given me a much clearer understanding of how utilitarianism tackles these big questions.
Good.
Before we wrap up, are there any other, like, key points or nuances within utilitarianism that we should keep in mind?
Yeah, there are a few things.
Okay.
First, utilitarianism judges actions based on consequences.
Right.
But the motivation behind the action isn't completely irrelevant.
Okay, so it still matters a little bit.
It does. Well, even though the final judgment focuses on the outcome, the person's motives can be important in the long run.
Okay.
Because if someone genuinely wants to do good, they're more likely to make choices that lead to good outcomes.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about those times when things don't go as planned?
Yeah.
Like, what about unintended consequences?
That's a really important practical challenge.
Yeah, because you can't predict everything.
Right.
Right.
So utilitarianism often has to work with the idea of probable benefit.
Okay.
Because we can't perfectly predict the future.
And I remember one of our sources also talked about personal integrity.
Yeah.
And how it might conflict with utilitarianism.
Yes, that's a big one.
Can you unpack that a little?
So the conflict between utilitarianism and personal integrity is something we have to consider.
Okay.
Because sometimes utilitarianism might say that a person should do something.
Okay.
That goes against their own deep moral beliefs.
Even if it benefits the majority.
Yeah, even if it leads to the best outcome for everyone else.
So it's like you're being asked to do something you believe is wrong.
Yeah.
Even if it leads to a good outcome for others.
Exactly.
That's a tough one.
It is.
And lastly, I know one of our sources mentioned adaptive preferences.
Oh, yes.
Can you explain that a little bit?
So adaptive preferences is this idea that people's desires and expectations change based on their circumstances.
Okay.
So if someone's been living in poverty for a long time, they might adjust their expectations for happiness.
Well, because they think that's all they can achieve.
Right. Okay. And this is tricky for utilitarian calculations. Because what people say they want might not reflect what would actually make them happy.
If they had more opportunities.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really insightful.
It is.
So while utilitarianism is a very influential framework, actually applying it in the real world is super complex.
It is.
We've learned a lot today.
We have.
We've explored how utilitarianism prioritizes consequences, the importance of the greatest happiness principle, impartiality, aggregate welfare, and the difference between act and rule utilitarianism.
Exactly.
We've talked about how it applies to moral and legal decision-making.
Yes.
And some of the challenges and nuances that come up along the way.
It's been a good discussion.
Yeah.
So I think the takeaway is that utilitarianism offers a very compelling framework for thinking about moral and legislative choices.
Okay.
It's about maximizing well-being. It's about focusing on consequences.
Okay.
It's about being impartial.
Right. And striving for the greatest happiness for everyone.
Exactly.
But it also faces some serious challenges.
It does.
Like figuring out how to measure happiness, protecting individual rights, and dealing with the fact that people's motives and actions can be unpredictable.
Right. It's an ongoing debate.
So here's a thought for you, our listener. In this world where we face such complex problems, how should societies balance this utilitarian idea of the greatest good for the greatest number with the need to protect individual rights and uphold justice?
That's the big question.
Is one more important than the other?
Yeah.
Or do we need to constantly be negotiating and finding a balance?
Right.
It's definitely something to think about as you navigate the ethical and political issues that we all face.
It is.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive into utilitarian ethics.
Yes, thank you.
And if this topic really piqued your interest, we encourage you to explore those sources we mentioned.
Yeah, definitely check them out.
There's so much more to learn.
There is.
And think about.